Yeah, so let's begin. And let me open with a word of prayer, okay? Father, we do thank you for this opportunity we have to gather together in this chapel to hear this message and to have this conversation this evening. We thank you for your gifts. We thank you for your calling. And particularly, given the nature of what we're talking about in this series, we just thank you that you're calling women as well as men, and that you are empowering all of us to do the work of the kingdom. And we ask that you would just bless us in our efforts and in those various ways in which we each fulfill the calling that is given to us. I pray that you'd bless our speaker this evening and just bless our ears so that we can receive well what she has to say. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so let me introduce our speaker this evening. And maybe for the benefit of some of you who weren't here yesterday, I'll just each of these talks is sort of standalone. So if you weren't here on Wednesday, for example, that's fine. Tonight's talk will be self-contained in and of itself. But first of all, let me just say something about Dr. Alexander. I've known Kim and her husband Corky we were trying to figure this out the other day, but it seems like it's close to somewhere between 20 and 25 years ago. And see her quite regularly. We go to a lot of the same conferences, and we have a lot of mutual friends, and the person that she did her doctoral work with is a very close friend of mine who I met when I was working. He and I were both working on our PhDs at the same time, so he's a very close friend. So through him, I became connected with Kim and her husband. Kim and Corky have had varied ministries over the course of their lives. To begin with, when they were younger, well, you're still young. Yeah, children. When they were children, they started as church planters, and they're both very good musical kind of people. So music is very part of who they are. So they are very much involved in worship music, that kind of thing. Then around the time that I first got to know Kim, she was making the transition into academia. So she completed a PhD. She's a historical theologian, and she had done her PhD on healing in early Pentecostalism and how that relates to the various soteriological currents that were present within Pentecostalism at that time. Okay, and then so she published that, and then she's also, a lot of what she's published is in the area of women in ministry, okay? And that's very much the focus of what this lectureship series that she's giving here at Northwest University this week is about, okay? The theme of this series is Pentecostal women in their place. And again, there's a certain kind of irony in that title as she explored yesterday in her opening lecture. And she's basically looking at women in ministry in terms of healing, which is sort of her focus yesterday, tonight, shepherds, and then tomorrow, prophets. But as far as this putting women in their place, or I should say Pentecostal women in their place, and the irony of that is, as she notes yesterday, unfortunately, because of male dominance in the church, oftentimes it has been a case of men putting women in their place. But she made a very interesting observation yesterday, and that is that ironically, as men put women in their place, what that directed them to was the very forms of ministry that Jesus himself chose. So the great irony is that women minister in capacities that are much more closely to what we see Jesus doing, which reflects poorly on us men, right? You know, we choose Satan's path as opposed to Jesus. No, but again, it just shows that arrogance and assertion and dominance doesn't get you there where the kingdom would want you to be, okay? So we're looking forward to the second message in this series, and focus is going to be more on shepherds this evening. So let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Alexander.
Thanks so much, Blaine, for that introduction again, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. So much hospitality that I've experienced already, and it's just been wonderful. And I have eaten like really good food, which is always a goal of mine in places that I go. Blaine asked me when I first got here, well, you know, what would you like to eat? And I was like, anything I can't get back in Hamilton, Alabama, which, if you knew anything about it, means pretty much anything you got on offer, because it's a small town, and we don't have very much. But thank you for all of that, and more than that, like fellowship and getting to meet new people and catch up with people that I do know, and all of those things. I also want to say that I'm really grateful to Blaine, not just for this opportunity, but I wanted to say this to you. I don't even know, I'm sure you're wise enough and smart enough to figure this out, but it's just really important that men open doors for women. Not in the sense of chivalry, but that's not a bad thing either, but in the sense of endorsing, helping, empowering, encouraging, because still in our world, we talked about this a little bit today in the informal fun meeting we had with women students who are in ministry, it's still a man's world that we're operating in, and in the church world especially, and in the academic world among our people. And so if it had not been for people like Chris Thomas, I don't know that I would have even had the courage to step into some of the places that I have. So thank you for what you do for women students here and in other places, opportunities you've given me in the past. It's really important. Some of the research that I did, even in the business world, they talk about how women, if they're not men who sponsor women, there's a huge study called the Catalyst Study that studied women in corporations. If men who have these positions of authority don't sponsor women, they don't get in the doors, they don't get introduced, and that's a sad reality of where we are. But I think there's a grace that comes with that, so thank you for doing that. I wanted to say this, I think I mentioned it yesterday, but I did, and I've talked to a couple people, I'm coming from back the southeast where there's like lots of revival happening on campuses. So if this goes that way, I'm good. I mean, I feel a little bad that I'm actually lecturing when there's revival on other campuses. I don't want to be that stereotypical academic who like kills the spirit. So I want to lean into the spirit as much as possible. So we'll see where this goes. I feel really passionately about it, so I could preach, who knows. The title tonight is Not a Hireling, Women Shepherds Laying Down Their Lives. And I'm going to tell you a quick story about where that comes from. And I tell this, it still makes me shudder when I tell it. I got this secondhand from reliable sources a few years ago, and I'm changing the names to protect people that aren't so innocent. And it's just horrific, and you'll see what I mean by that. It's a story that angered me, and it still does, but it also gets at a really critical issue. And this feels very loud. Am I too loud out there? Okay, maybe I'm just getting passionate up here or something, but I'll back off a little bit. So this is a quick story about in a particular Pentecostal denomination, a particular leader who was over a district. They were, as churches, schools, all that, as it goes, they needed to cut the budget. So, as often happens, the people that get cut are those at the bottom of the pay scale. And as it often happens, that fell disproportionately on women. So there were women who were like clerical workers and people like that who had worked in this church denominational office for years and years, who lost their jobs. And one of the ministers from the area was very concerned about that and mentioned it to the leader and said, these women have worked here a long time. it's just terrible. I just feel really bad about this. And he's like, oh, don't worry about them. They're not really ministers. They're just hirelings. Yeah, I knew that would happen, or I was hoping that gasp and that sigh and everything would happen, because it's horrible. And thankfully, even if people feel that way, they don't say that kind of thing very often. But it happens, and it falls disproportionately on women because women haven't had those doors open for them very much. Now, what it also is, obviously, is a reference to, not a very good reference, and I think a bad interpretation, but it's a reference to Jesus talking about himself being the good shepherd in John chapter 10. So that's on the screen, and you know it very well, and I'm not going to read it. But Jesus is describing himself, the qualities that he has as a good shepherd. And this is basically what he says. He knows the sheep, and he's known by the sheep. He lays his life down for the sheep. He brings sheep who are out of the fold back into it, and by doing that, he unites the flock. And why is Jesus able to do those things and unite the flock and lay down his life? He says, because he's in a very secure relationship with his own Father. The Father knows me, and I know the Father. And then he makes the case very clear. He says, he's not a hired hand. I'm not a hireling who doesn't own the sheep, who sees a wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away, and then the wolf snatches them and scatters them. Why does a hired hand run away? Because a hired hand does not care for the sheep. Now, to get back to that horror story just briefly, because I don't want to stay there too long, because I will say things I shouldn't. But the women who were terminated in that situation, I'm absolutely sure were not there for the money. I know what denominational offices pay, right? So these are not women who are hirelings. They're not there just for the money. They had been there long term. They had seen leaders come and go, move on to greener pastures, but they had stayed. Why? Because they loved the Lord. They loved the work of the ministry. Again, they were not hirelings. They were not in it for the money. There are a lot of biblical texts, and I'll leave that story alone. So there are a lot of biblical texts, obviously, that refer to shepherds as a model for pastor. In fact, obviously, linguistically, that's connected there. The shepherd metaphor is called upon often to describe leadership over the people of God, mostly in reference to Jesus in the New Testament. And these are building upon a whole tradition of Old Testament understandings. I'm always a little nervous around biblical scholars when I'm doing biblical study stuff, so I'm just going to go ahead and say that because I know they could correct me for things, and believe me, they have. But anyway, I got the mic. So they're building on this tradition of Old Testament analogies and metaphors of the shepherd that we're pretty familiar with. In Numbers 27, when God appoints Joshua at the request of Moses to anoint someone to lead so that the congregation, he says, would not be a sheep without a shepherd. That's God's words there. When God appoints David as king, obviously, his leadership was to be like that of a shepherd, which, of course, David knew very well what that was like. And in fact, in contrast to the other monarchies around them, the other people and the other cultures around them, the king of God's people was to be a different kind of king. And that model was of a shepherd. That's not a model that usually is associated with monarchies. But the monarchy over the people of God was to be a different kind. It was distinct exactly because he was to be a king that was like a shepherd and led like a shepherd. And this idea of the people of God being like a sheep without a shepherd recurs numerous times throughout the rest of the Old Testament, especially in the prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, and really famously in Ezekiel chapter 34. There's a list of the offenses committed by Israel's false shepherds. They feed themselves instead of the sheep. They fail to protect the sheep from prey. They have not searched for the lost and scattered sheep. So obviously Jesus is building on that and saying, but I'm the good shepherd and I do all of those things. And I love the way God ends his final word in verse 11 of chapter 34 of Ezekiel. And it maybe it's because of the translation I'm using, but it sounds very British to me. He says, God says, but don't worry, I'll sort it, right? So God says, I'm going to deal with that. I'm going to sort that. Now, I said yesterday, kind of to my surprise, when it just dawned on me a few years ago, this is true, though women found a lot of safe space in the healing ministry, the other irony of that, as Blaine mentioned one of the ironies, but the other irony of it is there's no real clear model of women as healers in the New Testament. Now, I may be missing something, and Blaine will correct me, I'm sure, but I can't think of one case of that. There are women receiving healing. There are women who are ministering, clearly. And you can maybe make a case for that when you talk about anointing Jesus' feet with oil, that's a kind of healing thing. But as far as doing healing miracles, we don't see that. We also don't see women literally mentioned as shepherds, though I think there certainly were women shepherds during that time period. But there are women in the New Testament who are fulfilling the role of pastor. They are doing exactly what Jesus describes a good shepherd as doing. They nurture, they're feeding the flock, they're seeking after the lost sheep, going after them and loving the flock. And there certainly have been women fulfilling those roles, whether officially or unofficially, throughout Christian history. So how then do we get to the place where it was even a question as to whether women can pastor? Now, I know, thank the Lord, in the Assemblies of God, in the Church of God, in the Pentecostal Holiness Church, on the books, women can pastor in all of those denominations and all those places. But the simple fact is women still aren't pastoring proportionately. You know, if women are making up the majority of membership of the Pentecostal churches, and they are and always have been, it's disproportionate that only certain low percentages of all pastors are women, right? So it's still not happening to the degree that you would think it would. So how do we get to this place? And we need to answer that question. And I should also point out that when I say I'm talking about that, I'm talking about especially senior, what today we would call senior pastor roles. There's still far too many congregations that just don't want a woman to serve as pastor. And people will tell you that even in mainline churches where they'll be appointed there, but the women have a very difficult time because of the pushback, because people don't believe that women should be in that position. So how did we get to the place that that is a reality, and we're still at that place? And then how do we get to the place, and I think this is the most important question, but it's related, that the role of pastoral leadership is understood in terms that are so different than Jesus' description of a good shepherd. That's really the thing that I'm wondering about. We hear, I remember my husband went to this church planting seminar, it was back in the Peter Wagner days or whatever. And they said, really the model we're talking about is that a pastor, because they're talking about these mega church, they weren't even calling them that in those days, but these big giant churches. And the model really is that a pastor is a rancher. And Corky just walked out, and he said, that's not in the Bible. I'm not called to be a rancher, So even those people realize they're doing something, that good shepherd thing, that just doesn't really fit what we think a pastor should be. So how did we get to that place? There are a lot of things that can be explored, obviously, but I would believe that history can help us to understand that trajectory. So what I want to do is consider first how early Pentecostals began to think about women in pastoral leadership, and offer then some case studies of women who exemplify that good shepherd model. And then finally, hopefully, we can think about implications of all of this for pastoral leadership. So there's an ambivalent history of women as pastors in the Pentecostal movement. Women as preachers and leaders was an inheritance from the Wesleyan and holiness movements, obviously. And in the mid-19th century, a holiness theologian, Phoebe Palmer, had articulated Wesley's doctrine of sanctification and holiness, and not just that, but like literally it was called the shorter way to get sanctified, which is a bad idea. I really love Phoebe Palmer, but anything that's the short way to holiness is probably not good. But anyway, it caught on. But more importantly, she also offered a major defense of women preachers, and it was based on the anointing of the Spirit being on them. But women were experiencing God in ways that were, scholars of Wesley call him an optimist of grace, right? So they have this very optimistic experience with God, and God has delivered me from these things, and I have purpose, and I have a call, and now there's this anointing of the Spirit upon me. And that's getting worked out. Charles Wesley, even before Palmer, is allowing women to stand up and pray publicly in what they called mixed assemblies, which was scandalous. But that's one of his new measures towards revival, right? So since we're having all these revivals breaking out on campuses, we might need to think about that. That, you know, one of Wesley's new measures was that women were very public in those situations. But women are also finding leadership positions in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Salvation Army, holiness associations, and social holiness organizations. They were publishing. They were editing journals that were dedicated to holiness and healing. As I mentioned yesterday, they opened and directed healing homes. They evangelized. They served as deaconesses and missionaries and pastors. They founded schools and orphanages. All of that before the Pentecostal movement even begins. So it must have been really a shock to these women that were now baptized in the Holy Spirit. It had gone even beyond that sanctification experience. When they read the words in 1914, and the AG people go, oh no, I know where she's going with this, 1914. The newly elected chairman of the General Council of the Assemblies of God, Ian Bell, in the then called Christian Evangel, the official magazine, 6 months after the Hot Springs meeting where the Assemblies of God is organized, writes this: "There is no instance of any woman being put in a place of authority to rule, govern, or teach in the authoritative sense, that is, by the authority of their office anywhere in the New Testament." Now, as a teacher, I would have already marked the grammar in that sentence and said, you're using the word authority like 3 times in one sentence, so you need to, but that probably is very revealing. That's a sore point with him. He goes on, when one speaks as a prophet, he speaks with the authority of God. But when one speaks as an apostle, he speaks with the authority of an apostle. I know. He not only gives God's message, but he also has authority to enforce it. This is really a clarification of a point that had been made in the minutes of that organizational meeting. In a section called Rights and Offices of Women, women were understood to have the right to prophesy and preach and to be, quote, helpers in the gospel, but ordination was conferred upon women as evangelists or missionaries, not as an elder. Now, the minutes also don't even use the language pastor at that point. And so interpreters of that then and later have said, but that was referring, the word elder was actually being used there for pastors. In 1916, Bell used similar reasoning in answering a reader's question, has a woman a right to be a pastor over an assembly of apostolic faith saints? And he says, there are no biblical examples. There is that messy thing with Deborah, he says, that, but that's an exception because there was no capable man available. That's the standard thing that you get from people who don't know what to do with Deborah. He also points out that this is a temporary solution and the woman should be, quote, wise and, quote, push the man when he is prepared to the front to bear the burdens in management and government, which God has especially designed for stronger shoulders. Okay, so yesterday we talked about women not having big voices Today, we're talking about men with strong shoulders. So, within Pentecostal circles, these restrictions were always really fluid because there were already women pastoring churches in what became the Assemblies of God at that time, right? So it was always fluid. There were women planting churches, which likely means that they were going to be the pastors of those churches. 64% of home missionaries were women, so they were probably pastoring. 2/3 of those planting churches were women, and 21% of the women in 1918 in the Assemblies of God were women. So it's always been fluid, right? So on paper it says this, but in the reality it's different. But the point that was made was it's really not the proper place, and so they need to get out of the way when this man with strong shoulders arises in the congregation or whatever. And this is also found in other denominations, so I'm not just picking on the AG. I wouldn't do that, especially since I'm on an AG campus. Because in the Church of God, which is my home denomination, we find the same kind of thing, as I've already mentioned. By 1912, leaders were beginning to borrow the language of, and this is verified, I mean, if you go and look at the literature that the Tennessee Baptist Association was putting out, the people in the Church of God just are kind of lifting that language, which is ironic because it was the Tennessee Baptists who had kicked them out for being Pentecostal. So there we go. But early Church of God credentials that were granted even to evangelists, male and female, for a very short time with regard to women, granted them the right to publish, preach, defend the gospel of Jesus Christ, to baptize, administer the Lord's Supper, and the washing of the saints' feet. So they had the right, for a very short time, even women did, to do these sacerdotal rites. But that job description was changed for women in 1914. So the discussions are different from, one denomination to the other, but always the issue is what they call ruling. And again, what is the place of a woman? And it was in almost every circumstance not to have any authority over men. Now, what's significant, I think, in these discussions is there's nowhere in those discussions anything about what kind of spiritual gifting the woman might have. That had been earlier in the discussions, but when they start organizing and borrowing and all of this kind of thing that they're doing from these other groups, it always goes to things about rights and authority and oversight, and gifting is nowhere in the discussion. So the other thing that's really interesting is when they describe what the rights are for a minister and that authority, they never refer to the very relational kind of way that Jesus refers to a shepherd. It never talks about care for the flock. Now, you would find that in some preaching, obviously, and things like that. But in official discussions of that, pastors are not really thought of in that kind of term. And I find that shocking, actually. So I would say that the problem, I'm going to argue, the problem is the definition of authority and rulership. Bell and M.S. Lemons in the Church of God, A.J. Tomlinson in the Church of God, reveal that what they really see as essential to authority is to use their words, big voices, and strong shoulders, right? So it's this very masculine kind of image, and that's what qualifies a person. Mary Beard, who is a classic scholar, not a Christian, but she recently pointed out this, and I think it fits. It's very important for this discussion. You cannot easily fit women into a structure that is already coded as male. So, what does that mean? You have to change the structure, and that's the rub. So, in the case of Pentecostal ministry and leadership, this restructuring begins with how we understand power and authority. And it follows, then, that we have to rethink how we conceive of the pastoral role. So we have these examples that we can draw from. Women, as shepherds, have laid down their lives, as we're going to see, not just for the sake of the gospel, but for the sake of the sheep. and that is the gospel. That's what Jesus did, so that is the gospel. So let's look at some of those models. In proposing a Pentecostal pastoral model that takes seriously the role of shepherd and the insights that we can gain from examining these models of women in pastoral leadership, I think it's helpful to think about what characteristics of a matriarchal community might look like, as opposed to a patriarchal one. Matriarchal societies are understood by social scientists as being not about domination by mothers, but it's about generation and relationship. And this is proposed by a kind of pioneer in this was a woman named Heidi Gottner-Abendroth, who pointed out that you can make that argument because the Greek term from which we get matriarch and patriarch, the term there can mean to rule, but it can also mean to begin, right, or can. She calls these communities societies of consensus and societies of kinship. And in discussing social implications of matriarchy, she says, what is most important in a matriarchal society is the fact that women have the power of disposition over the goods of the clan, especially power to control the sources of nourishment, fields, and food. So in this sense, I think we can argue that a shepherd's feeding of the flock and ensuring that it's nurtured and safe might be characterized as matriarchal rather than patriarchal. So let's look at the first case study, which is a well-known one, and that's Lillian Trasher. And because her story is more well-known, I won't spend quite as much time on it. Lillian Trasher was known as the Nile Mother, and it's a fairly well-known story. She was 23 years old when, in 1910, she arrived in Egypt to work with Pentecostal missionaries George and Lydia Brailsford. That's very early in the Pentecostal movement. She had only been baptized in the Spirit 1 year at that point. A few months after she arrived in Egypt, she was called to the bedside of a dying Egyptian mother. And when she saw this motherless child after the woman had died, she felt called to begin an orphanage. Now, she had worked in an orphanage in North Carolina and Lillian Trasher even at this point was associated with the Church of God, and she worked with an orphanage associated with the Church of God, the woman named Mattie Perry. But she feels called then to start an orphanage, and within 5 years of its 1911 beginning, she had 50 children that she was caring for, along with an Egyptian teacher named Sheikher Gad Allah. When she left for a brief period of time during political unrest, when she returned, she told readers of the Latter Rain Evangel, "I feel that I can never thank God enough for letting me get back safely to my children." The ministry cared for abandoned and orphaned children, as well as those with illnesses and disabilities who were unwanted. It expanded to provide care and shelter for mothers and children born out of wedlock, as well as widows. And in the 1930s, when Egyptian nationalist campaigns against foreigners and missionaries escalated, Lillian stayed while others left and began deliberately to act on her vision. And this is that matriarchal provision thing of the food and the fields. She began to deliberately act on a vision to make the institution self-sustaining so that all food and dairy were supplied by the farmlands and cattle that the orphanage owned. In the next decades, the ministry continued to expand and included a hospital wing and vocational training. And since its founding, over 25,000 children have been nurtured by generations of Lillian's disciples and children. Her model was based on family, with each generation caring for the next. Lucinda Yang, who recently did a PhD where she considered Trasher's work, she summarizes it this way: a true mother and overseer, Trasher worked tirelessly to provide financial stability, hope for the future, and spiritual care to all in her orphanage. She administered a familial model in day-to-day operations, causing the orphanage to eventually reach a population of a small village. Beginning her career as a single, simple, servant-hearted Pentecostal girl, Trasher eventually gained the colloquial title of Nile Mother, a name given to her by the thousands of orphans she raised in Assuat, Egypt. For 50 years, Lillian Trasher mothered and shepherded the most vulnerable, laying down her life. And upon the consummation of that life-giving in 1961, it's Chris Thomas time, I'm about to cry, she was buried on the grounds of the orphanage in Egypt. Next case study, Margaret Gaines, whom I'm calling a Pentecostal desert mother. And this story is less well known outside of Church of God circles, and the Church of God really doesn't even know what to do with Margaret Gaines. They have to honor her, but she wasn't a Zionist, and so that's really hard for them. So anyway, this story is less well known, but if I have anything to do about it, it'll be more well known. When she was 15 years old and a student at what was then called Bible Training School, which is now Lee University, Margaret Helen Gaines, who was the daughter of another pioneer Pentecostal missionary to Japan, Margaret Faith Piper Gaines, heard the pleading of another Pentecostal pioneer missionary, a woman named Josephine Planter, who had served in Tunisia alone for 40 years. Margaret's mother went to Japan in 1911. Josephine Planter went to Tunisia in 1914. Miss Planter is speaking to these, and she's in her 70s by this time. She also spent some time in a prisoner of war camp during World War I. She is pleading with these young people who are listening. Won't someone please go to the Arabs? She says, I'm old. Nobody loves the Arabs. Won't someone go? So at the end of that week of services, Margaret was in the altar and pleading with God, please send somebody to the Arab people. And she just pled over and over again. She shared this with me in an interview. And she said, God said to her, don't ask me to send anyone else if you're not willing to ask me yourself. Give me the opportunity to say no to you. And she asked the Lord, would you send me? And so she answered, she believed she had that call. Well, she was only 15 years old. So after she graduated from Lee, which was at that point just a 2-year school, she appeared before the Church of God World Missions Board. She describes it as going in this room with all of these dignified men sitting around a table. But her application to go to Tunisia to work with Josephine Planter was rejected because she was a single woman. She was devastated by that because she believed that was the way you heard the will of God, was through, your leaders in the church. But she returns to her home in Anniston, Alabama, in her home church. And in a church service, a revival service, when a woman was preaching, an evangelist named Mabel Branch gave a prophecy, and Margaret went down and prayed and stood up and announced, I shall soon be leaving for Tunisia. And somebody in the congregation said, oh, has the missions board reversed its decision? And she said, and I'd really like to have a t-shirt that said that, so this is great. I know nothing about the missions board. I only know the Triune Board of Heaven just approved it, and I'll certainly be going. Isn't that good? So, within a year, on March 25th, 1952, without any endorsement or financial support from a denomination, she boarded a train for New York City, and on April the 2nd, boarded a ship called the SS Constitution and sailed from New York Harbor for Tunisia. She greeted Josephine Planter on April the 16th. She was 20 years old. Her mother had been 25 when she went to Japan. While in Tunisia, she became fluent in Hebrew, French, and Arabic, studied at the University of Paris branch in Tunis, and got a certificate in Arabic. She remained in Tunisia for 10 years. And the picture there on the left is of her being greeted by Mrs. Planter when she got there. In her own reflection on her ministry model, which she wrote while she was a student at what's now Pentecostal Theological Seminary when she was working on her master's degree, she described her method of discipleship as parenting, following the example of her own parents who had been congregational holiness ministers, and that of spiritual mothers who had guided her throughout her teen and college years, because her mother had died suddenly when Margaret was only 10 years old. In Tunisia, her first disciple was a young Jewish girl named Yvette, whose father was physically abusive to her because of her conversion to Christianity. He actually was an atheist who had married a Jewish woman. After a severe beating that left her unable to even stand up, he threatened her with a loaded pistol if she didn't deny Christ. When Yvette refused, he pulled the trigger, but it jammed. Then he chased her with a knife from their home, and Margaret opened her home and her life to Yvette. And she wrote, "From that day, God gave me the privilege of making a home for Yvette, and he gave us protection from her father." Margaret led Yvette to a Pentecostal experience and nurtured her in the faith until she married a young Christian man from the mission Margaret had started in Maghreb, Tunisia. After 10 years in Tunisia and 2 years working with Tunisian expats in France, the Church of God reassigned her and appointed her to the church and Bible school in Jerusalem, which was then in Jordan. Navigating both the patriarchy of the Palestinian Christian pastor there, as well as the larger patriarchal culture, within a month, she visited the village of Aboud in the West Bank, where she said she felt an immediate sense of being home. She called it "my Arab parish." And she situated discipleship and ministry training in the context of family and very respectfully, carefully adapted that to a Palestinian understanding of those kinds of relationships, which served to advance her work. In doing that, she was able to contextualize her ministry before anybody was teaching people they needed to do that. It was just, she just intuitively knew that that's what she needed to do. And she developed indigenous leadership within the village of Aboud. Eric Newberg, who now is at ORU, who wrote a dissertation on the history of Pentecostal missions in Israel, he concludes that Margaret was successful and exceptional. In fact, he's told me, he says she's really the only one that was really successful. And he says the reason she was successful was because of contextualization, because she established indigenous leadership, and because she disassociated herself from Zionism. She understood herself as being a missionary in and not to a Palestinian village. In Aboud, she planted not only a Church of God congregation, but also an elementary school. And for that undertaking, she found local young women and one young Muslim man and trained them in teaching methods. One of those was a woman named Suhaila Khalil Khoury. Suhaila was one of 10 children who had been raised in an Orthodox Christian family, but under Margaret's mentorship, she became a Pentecostal leader. When Arlene Miller, an American woman who went to work with Margaret, succeeded her as an administrator over the school, when Arlene left Aboud in 1993, Suhaila became principal and remained so until her death just in November of 2021. Reflecting on Margaret's spiritual guidance of her, she wrote, "She asked me to pick up the cross of the school." Now, Margaret understood her own parents' approach to child rearing and formation, spiritual formation, to be one where she said they inculcated, quote, "a discipline of kindness and respect for people and things." And she also talks a lot about creation care, and they taught her respect for creation. And she said that really broadened all of their horizons. There were 5 children. And it prepared her for cross and intercultural ministry. As a young woman in Tunisia, now she had been raised in the Church of God. I know what that was like. I mean, I was born in 59, so she was older than me, but I mean, it was holiness in those days. It was strict holiness, and that's what she'd been raised in, which she said actually in many ways served her well, because she could work with Muslims who had very strict dress codes and all of those kinds of things, and that was not really a problem for her because of the way she had been raised herself. But she came across Henry Drummond's book, The Greatest Thing in the World, and she said that that book was second only to the Bible in her faith development, because what it taught her was over and against legalism. She was able to interpret what her parents had taught her through Drummond's view of love and kindness as a passport. She told me, with love and kindness, you can go anywhere. In a reflection on parenting as a model of formation, she recalled how spiritual mothers had seen her value and found ways to nurture that. She reflected that just as her own potential was seen and developed, even when she hadn't seen it in herself, she later learned to recognize and challenge latent potential in others. And she saw the acceptance of those relationships of spiritual parenting to her as being essential to ministerial well-being. Any minister, she said, who has never been parented but only received an impersonal education will betray that he was orphaned when he ministers to others. So that insight sounds very much to me like Jesus' own words about being secure in your relationship with your Father. Margaret recognized limitations imposed by gender, especially in patriarchal cultures, her sending denomination, and the Arabic cultures around her. At one point, she says to evangel readers when she's in Tunisia, I wish God would send a male minister here because I can't disciple male converts in the way that I can women. But she did disciple numerous men, but the most of her success was with women because she could have this much more close kind of relationship with them, take them into her home and that kind of thing. So in a kind of paradox, the boundaries that were placed on her because of gender resulted in establishing many female leaders in Aboud especially, but in other places as well. Though there are young men today who serve in churches and humanitarian agencies, theological education, Bethlehem Bible School in Palestine. Those were people that were discipled or converted and then discipled under Margaret as well. She understood leadership in non-authoritarian ways, having struggled under the supervision of patriarchal male leaders. And that kind of leadership, she said, that what she called that kind of authoritarian thing is professional only. And so she talks about parenting as being something contrasted with that because it encouraged, she says, full participation of the body of believers and a sense of belonging to a family when you disciple people and lead in that way. And she said in that way the church self-propagates. So, seeing themselves as spiritual mothers, both of these women who were lifelong single celibate women, Lillian Trasher and Margaret Gaines, might be understood in light, best be understood in light of women in the history of the Christian movement who offered spiritual direction from their perspective as celibates, like nuns, from positions of detachment from the world, because both of these women broke off engagements because the men they were engaged to, in one case with Margaret, the man was called to missions, but not to Arabs. So she didn't marry him. They remained lifelong single women. So they're offering this spiritual direction almost like women did in the context of monastic communities. So I think they can be understood as desert mothers. I think that's probably the best way to describe what they did. Now, Ricky Moore, who knew Margaret really well and was very close to her, he's an Old Testament scholar. He wrote a paper where he discusses Old Testament prophets as mentors. And I think the way he talks in the paper about Moses and Elijah and Isaiah, but I think the way he talks about Moses is really pertinent to this discussion. He says, Moses in Deuteronomy is a father who functions as a mentor to the children of Israel, and he does so in a paradigmatic way. For in exercising the mentoring role, he also models it and mandates it explicitly and repeatedly as the future responsibility and expectation of both this new generation and for all subsequent generations of the children of Israel. And this echoes what Margaret said about this kind of approach to discipleship being one that was self-propagating. It's something that can go on from generation to generation. Moore offers this implication of relational spiritual formation. He says, there is a profound spiritual dimension to raising up and blessing a new generation that includes but goes beyond a systematized catechism or curricular program of discipleship. It's more about being and being with someone than knowing what to do. Like Margaret, Moore is concerned with parenting as opposed to professionalism. So what are the conclusions that we can draw, and really more questions probably than conclusions, and what are the implications of this for a Pentecostal pastoral model? Well, I think given these stories of these matriarchs and their longevity and their success as Pentecostal leaders, we need to consider what that says to us about Pentecostal pastoral leadership. I'm always amazed by people that are brought in, and there's a lot of good done, but people are brought in to these seminars to teach us how to be better pastors or church planters or whatever, and they've never pastored a church more than about 2 years, right? Some of them, may or may not have even planted a church, but they're going to teach us how to do that. And I say that with great respect for leaders and education, denominational education, all those kinds of things. But that's just what I've seen over the years. I never see women in those lineups, almost never. Yet women have planted more churches, probably proportionately, than men, and have had longer pastorates. So what does this say to us? And is it transferable? Does this paradigm work for men? First, I think these women embody Jesus' model of the Good Shepherd because they lay down their lives for their sheep. Second, it must be noted that their gender, though in Margaret's case was first understood by the denomination as a shortcoming, inevitably led to a ministry that had the most direct impact on the society in which she ministered. And the same is true with Trasher. It's because they are women that people are bringing these children to them or asking them to start a school for their children or those kinds of things. Their work not only saved lives but transformed cultures and raised villages by raising women. They were doing that long before the UN started talking about it. Further, their gender resulted in their serving as mothers to younger women, providing refuge to abused women, rescue that would have been much less likely if the missionary had been male. Where would Yvette have gone when her father is chasing her with a knife if the only missionary there had been a single man? Where would she have gone? Though Pentecostal missions, like much of the larger Pentecostal ecclesial world, became dominated by male leadership and ministry models, and indeed was under the authority of male leaders, in point of fact, female missionaries like Lillian and Margaret were able to go to the heart of social problems in their host countries, even in extreme Middle Eastern patriarchal societies. In other words, gender was not a distraction from successful long-term pastoral shepherding ministry. In fact, it enhanced it. So this reality speaks to the age-old question of what women's place is, and answers, well, whatever it is, it needs to be a prominent place, right? Because all of this is happening. All these lives are being saved. Third, the matriarchal model, I think, informs Pentecostal spiritual formation in a way that's mostly neglected in the literature, both academic and just like church literature about spiritual formation, that tends to be drawn from examples dominated by men, such as, and this is a good example, Jesus and the 12, right? Paul and Timothy. And that's the best that it gets, right? That's good, but why not Naomi and Ruth, for instance, right? So the models tend to be male-dominated, and that's the best it gets because too often, models are drawn from the business world, corporate business world, or my favorite, sports models, coaching and those kind of things. So there is a body of literature that we can draw upon, especially as it pertains to desert mothers, but very little attention has been given to that. So how does this large and expansive history of women who have mentored others change understandings of spiritual authority from the perceived necessity of strong shoulders and big voices to authority that is situated in nurture and kinship, authority that derives, as with medieval mystics like Hildegard of Bingen and Catherine of Siena, from their spiritual experience, not their maleness. Finally, these stories serve, I think, as emblematic of how the Holy Spirit is embodied in the life of the Pentecostal church. The Holy Spirit is mothering us. The Holy Spirit is gathering, and like a hen gathering the chicks, brooding over us, encouraging us, and correcting us. Like Ma Jode in Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, the Holy Spirit keeps the church connected to the family, but also keeps her moving forward, pushing the church out of the nest. Ricky Moore described this Old Testament prophet mentor's call to leadership as, he says, ultimately the call addressing us all to follow, even to be the suffering servant of the Lord, giving up our lives for our children, indeed seeing the holy seed from the travail of our souls and being satisfied. Lillian Trasher and Margaret Gaines embodied that kind of call. As Moore said of Margaret Gaines, her oil has long been spilling across all borders and anointing daughters and sons everywhere she has gone. Thank you. So, Q&A?
Kim was wondering earlier if she should stay up here. If you guys who didn't heed the call and move forward, would you be able to see her if we move this down there? Would that be better? Would you feel better being on the?
I think it would be better for Q&A because I can.
Because it is weird up here with these bright lights and everything. Yeah, it's.
I have a chair. I think if we can just. Yeah, because I'll probably walk around.
This is set up for a narcissistic man. Up here. So.
Coded. It's coded male.
Yeah, that's right. It's coded male. Okay, so come down. I'll move this down.
I did not use the word narcissist.
Well, I don't mind using that term.
Not that I haven't used it.
Okay, so what we'll do is there's mics on the sides there, so we'll open it up for questions you might have of Kim, okay?
Yeah, and those can be about yesterday or anything really. Tomorrow, if you want to be, it's about prophet, so just be prophetic. Anything, nothing. Okay, well, that's okay.
So how would you define authority then? You didn't quite address that at the end. How would you address authority from a biblical perspective? How would you address authority from a biblical perspective in terms of pastoral leadership?
Well, as I'm going to say tomorrow, I think Mary is a good place to go. I think Mary, I'll go ahead and say it now, but I think she is the prototype of what it means to be a Pentecostal, actually. And so I think I'm not saying that there aren't male models in Scripture that we can draw from. I'm just saying those aren't the only models. And when we do only use those male models of authority, and the ones in Scripture don't look like the kinds of ways I hear authority described anyway. Jesus, somebody I heard recently said, Jesus is a 30-year-old man that's never married and has like a really close relationship with his mother. never would fly today and be in any kind of leader anywhere, right? That's like, he's got problems. He's never gotten married. He still lives with his mother, you know. So I think if we really look at even the models in Scripture, they look quite different than a lot of the kind of John Wayne muscular Christianity stuff that we see today. So I think authority, and you know, we could get into, and I can let Blaine do that. You can get into all what the words actually mean and all of that. But I think there are models of authority where, I mean, Jesus lays down his life, right? The kingdom looks completely different. And I think if we allow these models of women and this idea of nurture to be a really important part of that discussion, then it's going to change. I don't know that I have a definition. I just know that my mom had a lot of authority in my life. But it wasn't hard. I mean, my mom was she was a disciplinarian. She was a holiness woman. She's, all of those things. And I knew the rules. She was firm, but she was also very warm and loving and welcoming and affectionate and all of those things. So I don't know if people have a good relationship with their mother, and I realize, it's not a great image for a lot of people. It's not just bad fathers that are the problem. There are bad mothers as well, and cruel mothers. But in an ideal kind of setting, or discussion of motherhood, I think that nurturing, the act of motherhood in itself, the act of giving birth, is a laying down of your life for a child. It's a risky business. I heard a study that said they had tried to figure out what is the most stress that a human body could go through, and it's giving birth. And the only thing that comes anywhere close to that is some of these super athletes that do these, I don't know even the words for them, all these different events in one thing, That's the most stress that a body can go through, except giving birth. So the act of motherhood in itself is laying down of a life, is protecting, it's caring. And so I really think we should be drawing the model from the Good Shepherd. That's the model, I think. I'm just saying that looking at that women and the way they have pastored and the way they've shepherded gives us a lot of insight into what a pastor can and should look like. I don't know if I rambled a lot there, but I'm not real comfortable saying, well, authority is this, because that's authoritative, and I'm not real comfortable doing that. So, you can talk about it. What's authority in Matthew? What's authority in whatever?
Well, I would just say, picking up on what you were talking about yesterday, that authority language and power language is used so often for Jesus in the Gospels, and yet it's always in the service.
Yeah.
It's never a self-serving authority. It's always an authority in service of others, right?
Yeah. What today some people would say looks like weakness. That's the point. Jesus is a very strong authority, but it looks like weakness to a lot of people. Yeah. Anything else? Okay.
Would you mind clarifying Zionism?
Okay, well, Margaret lived for 40 years in Palestine, in the West Bank. When she went there, it was Jordan. She lived through and stayed during all of the wars. She never left. She stayed even though the embassy wanted her to leave, and the Church of God wanted her to leave because of the danger, but she knew that she could get access and get food for the people in the village when nobody else could. So she stayed and laid down her life. Margaret she actually wrote a book after she retired called Small Enough to Stop the Violence. And it was about the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And what she says there is that the problem with Zionism is that it confuses the national state of Israel with spiritual Israel. And that changes everything when you do that. So that's really the heart of her argument, because she says you cannot endorse everything that the state is doing, and as if it, just because it's the national state of Israel, that it's okay for them to do whatever, by whatever means. And frankly, that's what I hear a lot. You know, there's like no critical thinking about that. And Margaret's trying to work all of that out. And she lived there. She saw what the people went through. She saw the, very much like people who talk about protest in the streets, you know, after George Floyd or whatever. It's like that Langston Hughes poem, A Dream Deferred. You know, what happens to a raisin in the sun? Is it just going to wither away, or is it going to finally explode? And that's what she says about some of the violence on the part of the Palestinians. She doesn't endorse that violence either, but she says, you know, when children are growing up in this, it breeds things into them, and the problem is deeper than just, you know, the way it often gets depicted. So that's basically the arguments that she makes. And Newberg is the one who first said that because all the other missions were very much Zionist missions. I did hear Margaret say this to some Church of God leaders one time. They always took the mic pretty quickly from her after she'd say something like this. But I heard her say, I don't know, because the Church of God has a ministry to Israel. And at that time, which would have been in the early 2000s, essentially what that ministry did was help repatriate, bring people to Israel. So like Russian Jews or whoever. And I heard her say, she said, I don't know why you do that. It's against the law then for us to witness to them. Leave them in Russia and we can go and witness to them. If you want to win them to Jesus, don't bring them to Israel, because it's against the law to witness to them. So she was a very practical person like that. And and she had a great love. I mean, Yvette was a Jewish young girl. She had a great love for the Jewish people as well. But she just didn't think that just because they were in the nation of Israel, that everything that happened should be seen as okay. That was really her point.
I've often thought that in order for the church to function as God designed, the woman's place within the church needs to be completely restored. And as a historian, as a woman in academia, as someone who travels around regularly to different campuses and churches, I'm curious, what do you see regarding like the health of a church, specifically the churches that are recognizing women in giving them positions and recognizing their voices, positions of leadership, and recognizing their voices to minister? Can you just let us know what your observations are of that?
I don't know if you want to hear it, but I do think, I think things are, you know, I want you to hear me say, and I'm not sure I've made this point clear enough the last 2 days, I know that everything is not the way it was in that early literature that I've been reading from. But I think that did set up some things, you know. And so I think you have to go back and look at that and say, you know, some problems started setting in when we started trying to organize this thing, and we weren't really, my contention is, we weren't really thinking about what it meant to be Pentecostal when it came to offices. Even though Paul, who's doing a lot of the, you know, direction for us about that, is saying, I mean, he seems to be very Pentecostal when if you want to use that language, when he talks about his own experiences. So I think what we do, we all do this in some ways, but I think what we often do is we take those texts, whatever they are, and interpret them out of whatever we think the words mean now, what the culture says now, etc. And we don't really look at how those, what's been said there, the way they're having church there, all of those things were countercultural then. What does it mean now? How is that going to be countercultural? I do know that there's a lot of progress in some places. I do know that there are people who are very intentional about it. But I'll be honest, I know a lot of men, pastors, and they're my friends, who talk a good game. But when it comes to actually putting that into practice, they're still not having even that many women preach in their pulpit. And that's a kind of simple thing, right? So I told you, you weren't here, but I told people yesterday, this is not really what I had set out to do. I did not want to be talking about women in ministry all the time, because I thought people would say, she's always banging that same drum, but somebody has to do it, because I've been doing this now. I got my PhD in 2003. So that's 20 years. And most of the schools I know still have very few women teaching or leading them. There'll be every now and then it'll not be there. Most of the churches and denominations, they're making progress, and the Assemblies of God is making a lot of progress there and has been very intentional about that, and I'm very grateful to that. But I think we have to ask the question, for instance, and let's pick on somebody besides Church of God and Assemblies. So let's pick on the Foursquare. I think we have to ask ourselves, and they have asked themselves this, but what happened with the last election, and why in the Foursquare, and why have they never had another woman president of the denomination? And everybody thought Tammy Donahue was going to be the next president, right? Right? It was just almost a given. It was the first time I ever met her, which was years before the time it would have been. It was like, this is what's going to happen. The Lord's really directing this, and all of that. And then she wasn't elected. I think we have to ask ourselves why that keeps happening. And I think there are reasons that that's still happening. I think there are more people than we want to admit who are not ready for women to lead. And I'll tell you what Tammy said about the Foursquare Church. They, when she became supervisor over the North American churches, or the U.S. churches and pastors, they set up ministerial training so that egalitarian leadership was at the grassroots level. They were teaching everybody going for credentialing about women in ministry and all of that to try to set things right. She told me the places where there was the only places where there was real resistance to it was people who were buying into Reformed theology. And those are her words, not mine. The Mark Driscoll influence and all of that kind of stuff is the churches that were pushing back against women leaders. I think we underestimate how many people are still being influenced by that kind of theology. And I think there's a pushback right now. And I told women today, we have to, it always comes and goes in waves and all of those things. And it's very discouraging to be when you're in yet another period of retrenchment. You have to remember, okay, it's not always going to be this way. It's not always going to be this way. There will be, but that's what happens. And right now, in a lot of places, we're in that period of pushback. There's this war on men in this country, and there's this, all of that kind of language, and I still hear it. And so, on the one hand, I see a lot of glimmers of hope, but then I still see, with friends of mine, people I know in leadership in lots of different denominations, I'll still see these things, these pictures of these meetings they're having, or these advisory boards, or these conferences, or whatever, and there's still no women. And I'm like, no, how loud do we have to scream this, So we just have to keep it on the table. We have to keep doing that. And the pushback is really painful. And I'm tired of it. I've been doing this too long. I'm really tired of it. I thought we'd be further along by now. But we just keep backsliding, it seems, on that. So All our talk about worldliness, we never thought about how much we looked like the world in that regard. And I grew up hearing a lot of preaching about worldliness, but we never really thought we're just looking exactly like, we were countercultural. We were doing something very different. And then we just, dropped it and started looking like the world in that regard. So.
What would you say the impact of like the traditional family sphere, or the idea of like a traditional family, has on like how authority is relegated in the church?
Do you mean modern concepts of what traditional families look like and all of
Yeah,
that?
sort of like with the male role of the household and the female role of the household, like that kind of idea.
Well, first of all, one of the things I have said before, and I did some research on it, and some other people like Zach Tackett have looked at this as well, that model that got lifted up, women's places in the home, men, the breadwinners, and all that kind of thing, which in our, publications in the Assemblies of God and the Church of God, even in the Foursquare, especially after Amy died, it was lifting up this model of, women are June Cleaver. Y'all don't even know who that is. But anyway, the TV mom who's wearing pearls and high heels and doing housework, and, Ward Cleaver who's going off to work and coming home, and, she's got this amazing dinner on the table and all of that. But that was never even a possibility for the majority of Pentecostals in the United States, because they were immigrants, they were poor, they were black, they were not able. My grandmother, my dad's mom, was a textile mill worker working second and third shift her entire life until she retired when she was, 65 years old. And it wasn't long after that till she couldn't even walk anymore, because she had stood on concrete floors for, at that point, 45 years. And she had, I can remember the prayer meetings that she was having in what they called the back bedroom of the house. They would pray, they're in there, they are praying the walls down, she and these various women, and then she would go and catch her ride and go to the mill and work all night. So that model of the traditional family was a luxury that most Pentecostals could not even afford until very recently. Some of y'all, is that right? I think that's an accurate depiction. It's still not a reality in the majority of Pentecostal homes, because these are persons of Latin descent. These are people these are immigrants to America. These are people in Africa and other places. And so I don't think that we should be seen as having failed some sort of a ideal model. When who says that's the ideal role? My grandmother, who worked her whole life, my dad and his siblings would be considered latchkey kids today, because she had to work, and they were left on their own a lot. And let's see, one of them was the postmaster. My dad has an MBA, just retired about 15 years ago. The next sister in line had a master's degree and was a school teacher, and taught until she retired. And the youngest one was called to preach when she was 14 years old and is still pastoring a church. So, the whole idea that if the mom works, they're all just going to, go astray and all of that, it just doesn't hold water. So I don't think that's the family model we should look to. It doesn't even fit a biblical model of family, because in an agrarian society, everybody in the family was working. It was not. So I don't know if I even answered that question. I just think I think that's yet another cultural model that we're imposing on Scripture. I'm not saying that families aren't in trouble at all, But I think families have been in trouble a very long time, and there's a lot of other reasons that families are in trouble that need to be examined, and not just whether men and women are taking their rightful place.
To ask a question.
Okay.
A few times you've used the term muscular
Yeah.
Christianity, and that's not in comparison with flabby Christianity.
it's not. Or full gospel.
Yeah, it's a bad form of masculine
Yes,
dominant
yeah.
Christianity. Would you say that it seems that's almost overlapped with the history of the modern Pentecostal movement? If you think of Billy Sunday,
Yes.
and that kind of starting
That was
around,
kind of the beginning of the idea of muscular
yeah,
Christianity.
and
Because he was an athlete,
yeah,
you know.
and so as a historian, and keep in mind, lots of the suffragette movements going on around that same time. So how much of this is a reaction to women politically demanding a greater
Right.
voice?
I think it's...
And to what extent is
yeah,
the church then reflecting those sort of social political battles
Yeah.
that are happening?
That I think it very much is a reflection of the times. I think we forget that movements like suffrage began among conservative Christian groups, you know, like Wesleyans and holiness people and Quakers and people like that. Abolitionists, their next, you know, the next avenue for them was women's rights. And I mean, these are Oberlin people. This is Charles Finney. These are people like that. So I think we forget that for one thing. You know, the rise of these forms of Christianity, which have been called muscular because, you know, Billy Sunday, I mean, the picture, just Google it, you know, Google images of Billy Sunday and you'll see what we're talking about there. You know, he was acrobatic, you know, it's all this athletic prowess in his preaching. And then you have a rise of it, a kind of a resurgence of it after World War II. So I think that it parallels those movements of, you know, you've got kind of military aggression, you've got that model of what, you know, a soldier and masculinity and all of that, and then when women are working outside the home, that becomes a threat. If you go back and start looking at, like, material looking at for youth, for instance, in Pentecostal circles in the 20s, or also just the way they're talking about women in ministry, you know, all women are painted that work outside the home or who are trying to, you know, pastor churches or preach or whatever, they're painted like they're flappers, you know, and they're destroying the home and, you know, all that. And the next thing you know, they're all going to be smoking, painting their fingernails red. You know, it's that kind of rhetoric. So I do think it parallels this kind of anxiety that exists in society. And so you get these resurgences of it from time to time. So, I mean, charting it, there's probably more of them, but you can see that over and against Amy Semple McPherson, you know, Billy Sunday and Amy Semple McPherson. You can see it after World War II. I think you see it with Driscoll and people like that. I mean, you clearly see it with Driscoll. That's a huge thing in his Seattle ministry, right? And so it's something that recurs from time to time, and it generally is a response to women gaining access to, you know, positions of authority in some way. Yeah, and so again, you know, how much are we just reflecting the culture, and how much are we being countercultural? So I don't know if I answered that very clearly, but I think it's definitely a reflection of culture. I mean, what I hear people even today do, and I am certainly not denying the influence of, the negative influence of Hollywood and all of that. Okay, I'm not, that's just a given as far as I'm concerned. But I think okay, it's like people that say, well, I'm not a racist because they haven't ever lynched anyone, right? Or they haven't gone those extreme things. So it's like we take the most extreme thing, that's the enemy out there, right? Hollywood. Well, that's really not affecting us, we're not really willing to examine the stuff right around us that might be damaging and worldly, because it's just easier if we keep it at bay. And so I think Zach Tackett has done a lot more work on that, like the influence of television and all of that kind of thing on how Pentecostals viewed family. But I do think it's a reflection more of culture than it is actually reality. So, and you know what I want to say about this whole thing of authority, I've always just thought it was a silly argument to say that women can preach but they can't have authority. Because preaching, I mean, prophetic preaching is speaking for God. I mean, isn't that authoritative, right? I mean, you're bringing people into the kingdom. You're all of that. You're teaching them the word. You're all of those things. So I've always thought that was a really weird argument. And what it means is they're not talking about spiritual authority. They're talking about some other kind of, structure, and social constructs in the church world that just, and you can just look at it. I mean, the history shows that people have borrowed models from like the railroad, because that was a big one in the early days. How's the railroad set up? Well, we'll just orchestrate, and the Church of God did that, right? So we're going to set up the church like that. That's the model. Well, okay, but, or Walmart or whatever, it becomes the model. And that all has to do with like these lines of authority and, the flow charts of authority and all of those kinds of things. So rather than doing the hard work of figuring out what that might look like in our culture today.
There's a mic right there if you want to, Well, he's coming up, and just one brief follow-up.
Yeah.
And picking up on something that, what Sarah had asked you, with the impact that, say, a book like Jesus and John Wayne has had over the last 3 or 4 years, whenever that book came out 3 years ago, do you see a shift at all in the light of, say, the amount of attention and reflection that was given to, say, a book like that?
Well, I think what's happened is, as it often happens with books like Jesus and John Wayne, I mean, I think she's making some really good points in that book. She's done some good historical work, but I think it gets lumped in with and therefore ignored or discounted because it gets lumped in with some sort of liberal feminist agenda or whatever, and so it doesn't make the impact where it actually needs to make impact. So it becomes just yet another part of an echo chamber over there, and that's what's unfortunate. And it's, so other than in a classroom where you can have some sort of discussion about it and have actual critical reflection of it and everything, it just doesn't have that much impact. And I find that very, very frustrating because there's some, some really good, there's some points that really need to be made there. I mean, she did the research and showed how much Christian literature referred to, Braveheart, for instance, and she's got the statistics about it. Yeah, and Driscoll, Driscoll's Braveheart. I mean, this becomes, this kind of model, and she's done the good work of it, but it gets lumped over into this kind of liberal feminist thing. And then, of course, the other thing that happens is and this happens all the time, any discussions about women and full participation of women in the church, the fastest way to kill that discussion is say, well, the next thing that's going to happen is you're going to be talking about ordaining gay people. And it happens every time, And so something that, we have, understandings about as like sinful behavior suddenly gets attached to a woman in ministry. And that is the quickest way to kill that argument. It's a very emotional thing, and it happens all the time. So.
Question?
Yeah. Okay, great. I'll stand. You mentioned...
Those pants are like kicking.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. You mentioned something about stories. You mentioned the stories, and it reminded me of sort of how their move towards doing God's work in the Pentecostal movement was because of like a passion that they had, or God called them into this or that. And we talked about family dynamics. And for my mom, she's a pastor, and she did not know her dad, or her dad wasn't in her life, and her mom wasn't, like you talked about, that great of a mom. And when she gave her life, she just pursued ministry. So my question then would be, how would you encourage young women now to have interest in pursuing ministry more effectively, rather than other things and just happen to be in ministry?
Yeah, okay. So one of the things that, and I don't know as much about Lillian Trasher's background, but what Margaret Gaines did was, as these things, as happens often in church, there's some, if somebody loses their mother, then there'll be some sister in the church that will come along and take that on and become a spiritual mother. I've known so many people that will tell you that was their story. And Margaret writes very specifically about women who did that for her. The dorm mother when she was at Lee, and a woman in her home church. She had a stepmother that was not a great relationship, and Margaret takes responsibility for her part and not being a great relationship. But there were these other mothers in the church that modeled that for her, and as she said, they saw potential in me I didn't see. So I think in the case of anyone, and what she would say to anyone, male or female, who has a situation of parenting where a mother or father has not been everything that they need to be, or they've actually been abusive or bad or whatever, don't reject those spiritual mothers and fathers that God puts in your life. And it's easy to do that if you've been abused or you've been disappointed or rejected and everything. I work with young women now that's always the case. I can see it, when they start talking to me, that's what's going on there. So that's the first thing I would say, and I think that's what she's saying is ministers that are pushing things down on people and not all of that. She would say that they're insecure, because they have not been fathered or mothered themselves. And as far as women seeking to go into ministry now, anybody seeking to go into ministry now, male or female, that's a discerning process, and it needs to be a discerning process with, more than just you and one person or just you and the Bible. It needs to be over time, don't rush into it. I know it's really easy when you're young to think, I got to do this right now, but believe me, I'm old now, and I can tell you got time, so work out, and so discern that over time, but, avail yourselves of wise people in the Lord, and, people, I suspect sometimes when I hear about ministerial failure that is just like, fantastic ministerial failure that makes all the news, or I hear about these harsh, ministers who've been abusive and done these harsh things or whatever, I always wonder about their, what was their relationship like with their father? What was their relationship like with their mother? Because it's kind of that sins of the parent being visited on the children thing. I've wondered about Martin Luther. We know he had a bad relationship with his father, and so he could never feel that God loved him, right? He could never feel good enough. And so you can just about read a person's theology and tell what their home life was like. Yeah, you can. And so, but I think we have to discern anytime we feel that call, and discern very carefully with people who are wise. And then once you've determined, yes, I do have that call, it is your pastor's responsibility to help you in that and to lead you in that and mentor you in that. And, you know, I've often told young women who, you know, they're not getting that kind of support, I said, well, the first thing you need to do is kind of be in their face about that, because it is their responsibility, and you're calling them to that responsibility. If they choose not to do that, then you're going to have to go elsewhere to find that and do that. You know, don't feel like, well, he's just never supporting me, so I'm just, you know, I can't do it. But the first thing to do is, I mean, not in a disrespectful way, but go and kind of force them into that situation of being who they're supposed to be. And then if they're not, then you're going to have to find that elsewhere. But you should be seeking counsel from your pastor. They should be praying with you. You would not believe how many women in the research that we did in 2010 said that their pastor never prayed with them about their call to ministry. It was shocking to me. I don't remember the statistic off the top of my head. It was shocking, because that is their first responsibility. And so I would say to anyone going into ministry, be careful. You know, like people have said, if you can do anything else, don't do that, you know, because it's not easy. It's difficult. It is laying down your life. It is not, you know, a brand. It's not, you know, being an influencer on TikTok or something. You know, it's, in fact, just drop all those accounts. Just don't have those, you know, and, but seek counsel, seek wisdom from people. And, you know, and if you need spiritual fathers and mothers, then don't reject it. And pray for God to put those people in your life, and don't reject them, because they really do have some things to offer you. And don't, you know, they're not a bad spiritual father or mother if they tell you something you don't want to hear. You know, just like you know, a person's not a bad father or mother if they do that. In fact, they're probably good. They're probably a good father or mother. So I don't know if that answered or not, but that's what I would tell anybody. Discern, you know, and over time, because you got a long time ahead of you.
Okay. I guess I'll stand too. So he kind of sort of took my question, but so it's funny that you said that. I've actually, so I know that I'm called to be a pastor. And every time that I have spoken about this with people in leadership positions, they've kind of given me a look. And it is just like, discouraging. And so I think like sometimes I doubt, and is it because I'm Latin? Is it because I'm a woman? Like, what is it? And so I think,
Yes.
and I think it's also, you know, discouraging to see that like there's not a lot of women of color in leadership position. And so I think my question is, what advice would you give for any women in here that is pursuing in ministry? And so I think you did give input on that,
Well,
but if there's more.
If you came to me and said what you just did, the first thing I would have done was stopped you and said, how do you know? You know, and I don't doubt that you know that, but how do you know that? Because I do think that part of knowing is affirmation. Yeah. And that's actually what ordination is. It's affirmation that God has given you gifts and graces for what you're called to do. That's what we're just recognizing that when we lay hands on someone. And so so I think that's the first thing. How do you know? And I don't doubt it at all. And I know those looks. I've seen those looks. I've experienced those looks, and they're difficult. And people a lot of sincere, good people can give you that look, you know. So it's not that they're bad people. They just don't know what to do with you. That's really what it comes in. What? You know, she's Latin. You know, she's a Latina woman. You know, she's. You know, what's she gonna do? You know, and sometimes it can be even your parents or whatever, because they know what a hard road you're talking about. And so, again, I think seeking wisdom of a multitude of counselors is really important in that. I also say, and I say this fearfully, But I do think there's times for men and women when they're not getting the affirmation that they need, or even the discerning process that they need. It's just time to shake the dust off and go to another place. I heard this young woman, this was when I first went to Regent, actually it was at a conference before I ever got there when I was a speaker, and this woman said, I know I'm called to be a pastor, and I'm in a denomination that doesn't believe that women can be pastors, but I'm just going to stay. And Estrella Alexander, why? And that's the question, ministry is hard enough without having all of those barriers there that, you're never going to kick that barrier down. Now, maybe God's called you to just do nothing but kick at that wall for the rest of your life. But, you're going to have some good steel-toed boots because it's never coming down in some of those places. So I don't know why people stay in some places. And I can tell you this from experience. There's nothing worse than being in a place where the grace of God for you is not in that place. We stay and stay and stay sometimes, and it's like time to go, and that's a bad situation to be in. And you need to go where the grace of God is there for you. But again, there are people that maybe they're telling you things that you don't want to hear, and they're testing to see just how, so it's not this or that. It can be a lot of things, and I don't know the people. I don't know the situation. I don't even know you really. So, but don't stay too long where you're getting negative messages in anything, whether it's ministry or anything. It's just so damaging over time. Women have a hard enough time of that. I am 63 years old. I have been teaching graduate level education for decades. I've done some things. I've published some things. I still feel like an imposter sometimes because of the way society has put that on me. You're not good enough, and you don't really know what you're doing, and that kind of thing. And so it's, you need affirmation. And I know sometimes, too, we think, well, I've heard that, and I hate it. I hate it when people do, well, as long as I've got King Jesus, No, you got to have the affirmation of the community of faith. You won't make it with just you and King Jesus. So you'll be one of those crazy people, so. Okay.
I don't know if it's okay. So I actually had a second question. What advice would you give to young women who have experienced their voices be silenced in the church, and how would they, one, be able to overcome that, and two, be able to trust in the church to disciple them, I guess?
Okay, again, I'm always very careful answering a question like that when I don't know the actual situation. I mean, I've said this before about, let women keep silence. There's some women that do need to keep silent, so I try to be fair about all of that, but so I don't know, and I don't want to give you just this is always the way it should be kind of answer. But if your voice is continually silenced, you need to ask yourself why. Is this me? I think the first step is always self-examination in anything. Is there something I'm not seeing here? Lord, show me. Is there something here? And go to trusted people and those kinds of things. That would be my first advice. But you need to go where people are going to affirm you and celebrate you ultimately. And, if you read the story, and like I say, I've spent more time reading Margaret Gaines' story. Thankfully, Margaret Gaines wrote about 4 books. And so we have, her memoir, and then we have this travel log memoir that she did about all of her travels as a missionary and everything. And then she wrote books like Small Enough to Stop the Violence, and then she wrote one that was never published about the village of Abood where she is. And so we know, a lot of, and I've got her master's thesis, and I've got all kinds of things. So I know a lot about her. And what's really interesting to me is, because think about this, is 1950s in the South. What's really interesting to me is when she would come against these male voices that silenced her, and they were male voices in almost every case. God always sent some woman to affirm her and to prophesy over her, or it's just uncanny. I don't even know if when she wrote, she was aware of how many women are in her story, that were speaking into her life in very specific ways, just like that evangelist that morning where she stands up and says, well, I know the Triune Board of Heaven, has said I'm going, and I'm going. So, and it was because of this woman. So I just started making a list, and it was amazing to me how many women were speaking to her every time she would have these kind of discouraging words. Now, I will say this about her as well. She would submit. She was a stubborn person, which is, I think, and she says that, which is what, you don't stay 40 years anywhere without having some level of being stubborn. But she also recognized it could be detrimental to be that way. And so she would submit to male leaders, even sometimes when she did not agree with them. And she always said, because I needed that spiritual discipline in my life. And I really respect that. But the other thing that she and a lot of these women would do is they could stay in good standing, but they also could figure out ways to work around the system, So, and so she did that. And after she'd been in Tunisia a few years and was having some success, the Church of God sends her a letter and starts sending her support, and then they say they want to give her credentials. And she said she was first like, why do I need that? But then she said, but I knew my own pride, and out of submission and to the Lord and spiritual discipline, then I submitted to that. And so hers is a good example of how somebody had to just navigate around a lot of that, but at times submitted even when she didn't agree with the leaders over her and their decision. There's one great story, it's in that travel memoir that she wrote. It's called I Will Go, and it was published by Church of God World Missions. And the title of the chapter is In Search of an Ordained Male Minister. Well, that tells you right off and this is while she's in Tunisia. She had not been home at all. She had been there 8 years and had never been on a furlough. She'd won all these converts to the Lord, and she was going to go on furlough, and she did not want to leave them without what she said was the most basic part of being a Christian, and that was being able to be baptized in water, because she was not authorized to baptize. And so she kept writing to the Church of God leaders and saying, I need you to send a male minister. She'd get no answer. So she got on a boat. She could only afford like a deck chair, and rode on a deck chair across the Mediterranean Sea and just showed up in Germany at the overseer over Europe and the Middle East house and said, I need a male minister here. And, and they sent somebody down, and there was a revival, and then they baptized everybody, and then she could go on her sabbatical. But I just died laughing, or her furlough, when I saw that, in search of a male ordained minister. She never said, because they wouldn't let me do it, and, it's just that very subtle way that she was letting us know that, she had done all the work, but she had to submit to them to even baptize her converts. Now, I'm just telling you, I probably would have gone ahead and done it. Yeah. Right? But you know what she said when she came back and she met with the missions board that time? They said to her, well, what if we don't let you go back? She said, I'm not a bit worried about what you're going to say, God is going to show me where to go. And so after her experience, she had a very different experience meeting with them because she felt confident in God. She knew her father loved her, and she loved her father. And so therefore, she could lay down her life regardless of what that dignified group of men around that table said. That's exactly the way she tells that story. So, okay.
Kim, well, thank you so much for sharing all these great stories with us. It's been wonderful. Yes, thank you.